That child has no business sitting at your table during dinner, ma'am. Margaret Pierce's sharp voice sliced through the heavy silence of the dining room like a knife through silk. Victoria Whitmore, 72 years old, froze with her fork halfway to her lips. Her steel-gray eyes took in the scene unfolding before her. 8-year-old Kevin, the son of Carmen, her devoted housekeeper, had quietly taken a seat in the chair beside hers at the massive mahogany dining table. The table could accommodate 16 guests, yet for years it had served only one. Margaret Pierce, Sister Victoria's deceased husband and self-appointed keeper of family propriety, pointed an accusatory finger at the boy. "Carmen, control your child. He lacks the manners to dine with his betters." Little Kevin lowered his head, his small hands nervously gripping the napkin he had so carefully placed across his lap moments before. Carmen rushed from the kitchen, her face flushed with mortification and fear. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Victoria. Kevin, come here immediately." But Victoria raised one hand, halting Carmen mid-step, her blue-gray eyes fixed on Margaret with an iciness that could freeze summer itself. "Stop right there, Carmen." Victoria had built a real estate empire alongside her husband, navigating boardrooms and negotiations with legendary skill. But after his death 3 years ago, she had withdrawn completely from the world. The enormous dining table had become her throne of solitude, where she consumed tasteless meals in suffocating silence, chewing her loneliness along with her food. Margaret smiled with cruel satisfaction. "Finally, you're showing some sense of propriety, Victoria. These people need to understand their place." "Kevin," Victoria said, completely ignoring Margaret's comment, "you may remain seated. In fact, I would very much enjoy your company at dinner." The shock on Margaret's face was instantaneous. Her eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. As the unofficial head of the family council and the primary beneficiary named in Victoria's will, she was unaccustomed to being contradicted, especially not in front of the help. "Victoria, this is absolutely unacceptable. What will the neighbors think? You're allowing—" She paused for dramatic effect, her gaze sweeping over Kevin with undisguised contempt. "This child to sit at our family table." Victoria chewed her piece of salmon slowly, deliberately, watching Kevin. The boy had relaxed slightly but still kept his eyes downcast. There was something about his quiet dignity, the way he maintained his composure despite the hostility, that touched a chord in her heart that had lain dormant for years. "Margaret," Victoria said finally, her voice low but laden with unmistakable authority, "this is my house and my table. Kevin is welcome here." Margaret Pierce stormed from the room, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. But Victoria caught the calculating expression that flashed across her face. She knew that look all too well. It was the same expression Margaret had worn during the reading of her husband's will, when she discovered she would inherit nothing as long as Victoria remained alive. As Kevin smiled shyly and began to eat, Victoria could never have imagined that this simple meal had just ignited a war. Margaret Pierce would not tolerate a black child threatening her position in the family, much less her multimillion-dollar inheritance. What Victoria didn't yet know was that Margaret had been secretly monitoring every movement in the house for months, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, finally, she had found exactly the ammunition she needed for her sinister plan. 3 days after that fateful dinner, Margaret Pierce returned to the Whitmore mansion carrying a leather briefcase and wearing an expression that could have frozen hell itself. This time, she didn't come alone. David Wellington, the family's attorney for 2 decades, accompanied her. His solemn demeanor signaled an approaching storm. "Victoria, we need to discuss something urgent," Margaret announced, settling herself into the velvet armchair in the living room as if she owned the place. "It concerns this inappropriate situation you're permitting under your roof." Victoria continued embroidering quietly, her fingers working the needle with practiced precision, pretending not to notice the tension crackling in the air. Kevin played quietly in the corner with wooden blocks she had given him, while Carmen discreetly dusted the bookshelves. "David has brought some very interesting documents," Margaret continued, opening her briefcase with deliberate slowness. "Were you aware that allowing employees and their families to reside on property inappropriately could invalidate certain clauses in your will?" The lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mrs. Whitmore, technically speaking, there are legal interpretations that could be challenged if allegations were made suggesting you're not maintaining the family's traditional standards. Victoria finally looked up from her embroidery, her gaze sharp. How fascinating that you all suddenly care so deeply about family traditions, Margaret, considering you barely visited when my husband was alive. How dare you? Margaret slammed her fist on the coffee table, making the china rattle. Robert trusted me to safeguard the family estate after his death. That includes ensuring you maintain the dignity of this household. At that moment, Kevin accidentally knocked over a wooden block. It rolled across the marble floor with a soft clatter. Margaret whirled toward him like a viper ready to strike. "You see," she hissed, "he can't even play without causing disruption. This child is transforming this respectable house into a common daycare center." Carmen stepped forward, her fists clenched at her sides. "My son isn't bothering anyone, ma'am. Your son," Margaret spat the word like poison, "shouldn't be in the same room with us. You two are confusing temporary kindness with permanent entitlement." Victoria observed the scene with outward calm, but something fundamental had shifted inside her. She had known Margaret long enough to recognize that particular expression. It was the same look she'd worn as a young girl when she deliberately destroyed other children's dolls at the social club. Pure malice disguised as moral superiority. "David," Victoria said coldly, "do you honestly believe there's legitimate legal grounds to question how I manage my own household?" The lawyer hesitated, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "Well, there are precedents when allegations arise regarding undue influence over estate decisions." "Undue influence?" Victoria laughed, a hollow, icy sound. "From an 8-year-old child." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes glittering with malice. "Victoria, you're being manipulated. That woman," she pointed at Carmen with barely concealed disgust, "brought her son here deliberately. She knows you're alone and vulnerable. She's using that child to gain your sympathy and secure a privileged position in this family." "That's a lie." Carmen exploded, tears of rage streaming down her face. "I've worked honestly in this house for 2 years. I've never asked for anything beyond my earned salary." "Of course you wouldn't ask directly," Margaret smiled cruelly. "But allowing your son to seduce a lonely widow, it's quite a clever scheme, I must admit." Victoria set her embroidery aside and rose slowly to her feet. When she spoke, her voice carried a dangerous edge that Margaret didn't recognize. "Margaret, you just accused Carmen of exploiting her own child to manipulate me. That is an extraordinarily serious accusation." "It's the truth," Margaret insisted, lifting her chin defiantly. "And if you don't take corrective action immediately, I'll be forced to protect the family's interests through other means." The silence that followed was deafening. Kevin had stopped playing and watched the adults with wide, confused eyes. Carmen trembled with suppressed fury. And Victoria wore a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Other means," she repeated softly. "Elaborate, please." Margaret lifted her chin even higher. "There are institutions that specialize in caring for elderly individuals who may be making inappropriate decisions due to isolation and declining mental faculties." The threat hung in the air like a blade suspended by a thread. Victoria looked at David, who carefully avoided her gaze, then back at Margaret, who stared at her with triumphant arrogance. "I see," Victoria said finally, her voice dangerously quiet. "So you're suggesting I should be declared incompetent simply because I chose to share a meal with a child?" "If necessary," Margaret replied without the slightest hesitation. In that moment, observing the cold cruelty radiating from Margaret's eyes, Victoria realized she had seriously underestimated her sister-in-law's ruthless ambition. But what Margaret couldn't see was that for the first time in 3 years, Victoria felt something she had completely forgotten: the thrill of intellectual combat. Each new threat only fueled a quiet determination growing within her, awakening a strength that had lain dormant since she and her husband had built their empire together, crushing competitors who had underestimated them. What Margaret and her prejudiced allies didn't understand was that every word of contempt, every threat, was sealing their own fate. Because no one who truly knew Victoria Whitmore would dare underestimate a woman who had destroyed adversaries far more formidable than a greedy sister-in-law. That same night, after Margaret and David departed with their veiled threats still echoing through the mansion's halls, Victoria remained seated in her private office for hours. The amber light from her mahogany desk lamp illuminated stacks of financial documents she hadn't reviewed since her husband's death, papers containing secrets even she had forgotten she possessed. Carmen had tucked Kevin into bed and discreetly brought Victoria a cup of chamomile tea. "Ma'am, are you all right? You seem troubled." Victoria looked up, studying the honest face of the woman who had maintained her household with impeccable dedication for 2 years. "Carmen, tell me about Margaret. What have you observed during her visits?" Carmen hesitated, clearly uncomfortable discussing her employer's family member. "Well, she always asks many questions about your daily routines, your medications, your emotional state." "Interesting." Victoria made a mental note. "What about my finances?" "I once overheard her asking Mr. David when you'd be signing the updated will papers." She seemed extremely anxious about it. Victoria smiled coldly. Margaret had made the classic mistake of the greedy, showing her hand too early. "Carmen, I need to tell you something important about our situation and what's about to unfold." The next morning, Victoria did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She called Jonathan Myers, the private investigator who had helped her husband uncover attempts at industrial espionage during construction of their real estate empire. Myers was discreet, efficient, and possessed a network of contacts rivaling any government agency. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Myers's deep voice sounded surprised over the phone. "I haven't heard from you since Robert's funeral. How can I assist you?" "Jonathan, I need you to investigate my sister-in-law, Margaret Pierce. Specifically, her financial situation over the past 5 years and any attempt to influence healthcare professionals or attorneys. Do you suspect something specific?" Victoria gazed out the window, watching Kevin play in the garden with a carefree joy that contrasted so sharply with the artificial tension Margaret had injected into the house. "I suspect she's orchestrating a scheme to have me declared incompetent. And, Jonathan, I want you to uncover everything about her. Everything." Meanwhile, Margaret Pierce was far from idle. That same afternoon, she met with Dr. Harrison Mitchell, a private psychiatrist notorious for his ethical flexibility when adequately compensated. His office was located in a discreet neighborhood, far from the prying eyes of the social elite. "Dr. Mitchell, thank you for seeing me on such short notice," Margaret said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "As I mentioned on the phone, I'm deeply concerned about my sister-in-law's increasingly erratic behavior." Dr. Mitchell adjusted his glasses, opening a blank medical file. "Tell me about these troubling behaviors." "She's becoming inappropriately attached to the housekeeper's family, particularly to the woman's child. She's allowing them to dine at the family table, giving them expensive gifts." Margaret paused for dramatic effect. "I fear she's being manipulated in her vulnerable state of prolonged grief." "And you mentioned changes to her will?" "Exactly. She's spoken of substantially altering the distribution of her estate to include these strangers. As a medical professional, don't you find that indicative of declining mental stability?" Dr. Mitchell took careful notes, his pen scratching across the paper. For $45,000 in cash, he would diagnose almost anything. It could certainly be construed as a case of early onset dementia or susceptibility to undue influence. Naturally, I would need to conduct an in-person evaluation. Margaret smiled, satisfied. "That can definitely be arranged." What Margaret didn't know was that Victoria had spent that entire afternoon at the law offices of Patricia Coleman, an estate planning attorney who had built her formidable reputation on destroying fraudulent attempts to contest wills. Coleman was legendary for her strategic brilliance and had never lost a case when representing the legitimate party. "Ms. Whitmore, based on the documents you provided, I can confidently state that any attempt to challenge your mental capacity would be extremely difficult to sustain in court," Coleman said, organizing papers across her desk. "Your finances are impeccably maintained. You show absolutely no signs of cognitive decline. And most importantly, you have the absolute legal right to determine how to distribute your estate." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. But what if they produce a corrupt doctor willing to attest to my supposed incompetence? That's where it becomes very interesting. Coleman smiled with predatory satisfaction. Any medical professional who signs a falsified psychiatric report is committing a serious federal crime. And if we can prove a conspiracy to commit fraud... She paused significantly. We're discussing potential prison time, not merely civil penalties. That evening, Victoria received her first call from Jonathan Myers. Ms. Whitmore, you were absolutely right to be suspicious. Margaret Pierce is drowning in serious financial trouble. She's lost over $200,000 in failed speculative investments over the past 3 years. Victoria settled deeper into her chair, bracing herself. And there's more. She hired an attorney specializing in contesting wills 6 months ago, the same firm that represented that infamous case where they successfully had a widow declare incompetent to seize her inheritance. And Ms. Whitmore, she's already been spreading rumors about your mental deterioration throughout your social circles. Victoria felt cold fury settling in her chest like ice. This wasn't simply greed. It was a meticulously orchestrated campaign to destroy her reputation and steal her autonomy. Keep investigating, Jonathan, especially any connections to healthcare professionals willing to falsify diagnoses. After ending the call, Victoria glanced through her office's half-open door. She could see Kevin helping Carmen organize books on the shelf, the two of them laughing softly over something. The peaceful domestic scene contrasted brutally with the war Margaret had declared on her newly formed family. Victoria realized then that Margaret had made a fatal miscalculation. She had attacked not only Victoria, but also the people Victoria had learned to love. And that transformed this from a simple inheritance dispute into something far more dangerous, a battle for dignity, for the right to choose her own family, and for the right to live without fear of betrayal by her own relatives. For a brief moment, Margaret Pierce had achieved what she wanted, making Victoria feel threatened and isolated. But what that greedy woman couldn't comprehend was that Victoria Whitmore hadn't built an empire by yielding to intimidation. She certainly wouldn't allow anyone to weaponize racial prejudice to destroy the first genuine family she had found in decades. The war had begun, and Margaret had no idea she was already losing. On Friday morning, exactly 1 week after Margaret's explicit threat, Victoria was serving pancakes to Kevin when the mansion's doorbell chimed insistently. Carmen peered through the window, and her face instantly drained of color. "Miss Victoria," she whispered urgently, "there are 3 vehicles outside. Margaret, the lawyer, a man I don't recognize, and 2 paramedics with a stretcher." Victoria continued serving breakfast with remarkable calm, though Kevin sensed a tension electrifying the air. "Miss Victoria, are you okay?" "Perfectly fine, sweetheart," she replied, kissing his forehead gently. "In fact, I've never been better." Margaret burst to the front door without waiting for permission, followed by David Wellington, Dr. Mitchell, whom Victoria immediately recognized from the photographs Jonathan Myers had provided, and 2 uncomfortable-looking paramedics who clearly wished they were anywhere else. "Victoria," Margaret declared with theatrical gravity, "the time has come for you to receive the proper medical care you desperately need. Dr. Mitchell, please explain the situation." The psychiatrist approached clutching a clipboard, carefully avoiding Victoria's direct gaze. "Ms. Whitmore, based on extensive reports of your increasingly erratic behavior and dangerously inappropriate financial decisions, I've determined that you pose a significant danger to yourself. You require immediate hospitalization for comprehensive psychiatric evaluation." Victoria smiled. It was the coldest smile Margaret had ever witnessed, and for the first time in years, she felt a genuine chill of fear run down her spine. "How fascinating," Victoria said, walking calmly to her coffee table and picking up a tablet computer. "Dr. Mitchell, would you mind repeating that statement loudly and clearly so everyone can hear?" "I said you require immediate psychiatric hospitalization," he repeated, now more confident with Margaret's supportive presence. Victoria tapped the tablet screen. Immediately, Dr. Mitchell's own voice filled the room from the device's speakers. "For $45,000 in cash, I would be willing to diagnose almost anything. I could easily construct a case of early-onset dementia or undue influence." The silence that followed was absolute. Dr. Mitchell turned white as fresh snow. Margaret felt her legs begin to buckle beneath her. Interesting recording, wouldn't you say? Victoria continued, now circling Margaret like a predator stalking wounded prey. Jonathan Myers is remarkably efficient. He managed to record your entire conversation in his office last Tuesday. Margaret tried desperately to regain her composure. That's illegal. Unauthorized recordings aren't admissible as evidence in court. Victoria laughed, a genuinely amused sound. Margaret, you're speaking to someone who built a real estate empire from the ground up. Do you honestly believe I don't understand recording consent laws? Jonathan was posing as a patient in the adjacent waiting room. Dr. Mitchell spoke far too loudly about his criminal enterprise. In our state, only one party needs to consent to a recording. Jonathan consented to recording himself. David Wellington took a cautious step backward, clearly calculating his chances of escaping without consequences. But Victoria wasn't finished. Wait, there's more entertainment. She tapped the screen again. This time, Margaret's own voice echoed through the room. If we can have her admitted for 72 hours under psychiatric observation, we can challenge all of her recent decisions, including any modifications to her will, especially changes that would benefit unsuitable people. Carmen gasped, finally comprehending the full magnitude of conspiracy against her employer. Kevin hid behind her, frightened by the palpable tension saturating the air. David. Victoria turned to the lawyer with glacial calm. Do you have anything to contribute? Or would you prefer I play the recording where you discuss forging medical documents? The lawyer was visibly panicking now, sweat beading on his forehead. Victoria, please, I can explain. Margaret approached me. She insisted you were genuinely ill. Liar. Margaret exploded, realizing she was being abandoned by her own accomplices. Victoria, you're bluffing. There's no possible way you could have recorded private conversations. Victoria approached her slowly, eyes glittering with cold satisfaction. Margaret, 30 years of building businesses taught me one fundamental principle. Always document everything. Everything. She picked up a thick folder from the side table and opened it, scattering documents across the sofa like damning evidence in a courtroom. Bank statements showing your losses of $200,000 in catastrophically bad investments. Correspondence with real estate agents attempting to sell your house in secret. Email exchanges with David discussing strategies to have me declared incompetent. And my personal favorite. Victoria held up a printed photograph. Margaret meeting Dr. Mitchell in a casino parking lot, handing him what appears to be a very thick envelope. Jonathan is exceptionally talented with a telephoto lens. Dr. Mitchell attempted to slip away discreetly toward the door, but Victoria blocked his path with surprising agility. Oh, doctor! Please don't leave yet. I'm certain the state medical board will be absolutely fascinated by your innovative practices, especially when they learn you've already lost your license in 2 other states for remarkably similar conduct. The color drained completely from the doctor's face. How? How did you possibly discover that? The internet, Victoria said simply with a slight shrug. It's remarkable how much crucial information remains accessible to those who actually bother to search for it. Margaret was now visibly desperate, perspiration dampening her designer blouse despite the air conditioning. All right, perhaps we were overzealous in our approach, but that doesn't change the fundamental fact that you're being manipulated by these people. Victoria walked over to Kevin, who gazed at her with a mixture of admiration and confusion, and placed her hand affectionately on his shoulder. Manipulated, she repeated, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. Margaret, allow me to clarify something with absolute precision. This boy and his mother have given me something you never offered during 20 years of marriage to my late husband, a genuine family, authentic companionship, love without financial calculations or ulterior motives. Margaret made one final desperate attempt. Victoria, please consider what Robert would think about all this. Robert. Victoria smiled, and this time the expression held genuine melancholy. Robert despised you, Margaret. He told me repeatedly that you only appeared when you needed money, and he left extremely clear instructions about what actions I should take if you attempted to blackmail or manipulate me after his death. She walked to the wall safe and entered the combination with practiced fingers. From inside, she withdrew a sealed envelope, holding it up for everyone to see. A letter from my late husband, written 3 months before he died, describing precisely this type of situation. It explicitly authorizes me to completely sever ties with anyone who attempts to exploit me during my time of grief. Margaret lunged forward, trying to grab the envelope, but Victoria smoothly evaded her grasp. Oh no! This letter is going directly to Patricia Coleman, my new attorney who specializes in fraudulent contests, along with all the recordings, photographs, and evidence of your conspiracy. David Wellington finally found his voice, though it trembled. Victoria, perhaps we can reach some kind of agreement. Agreement? Victoria's laugh was sharp and humorless. David, you conspired to have me forcibly committed to a psychiatric institution using a bribed doctor. The only agreement we'll have is when the Bar Association determines the length of your suspension or possibly disbarment. Dr. Mitchell tried once more to head for the door, but this time Carmen blocked his way, her eyes blazing. Doctor, Carmen said, her voice trembling with contained rage, you were willing to separate a child from his family just for money. You're not leaving this house until the police arrive. As if on cue, the distinctive sound of sirens began approaching the mansion. Victoria checked her watch with theatrical precision. Ah, that must be the federal investigators. When Jonathan discovered your extensive financial losses, Margaret, we thought it prudent to report certain glaring inconsistencies in your tax returns for the past 5 years. Tax fraud carries quite serious penalties, I understand. Margaret collapsed into an armchair, finally comprehending the total magnitude of her defeat. It wasn't merely the money she had lost. It was her freedom, her reputation, her social standing. Everything. How? She whispered, looking as if she'd aged 20 years in 20 minutes. Victoria sat down gracefully across from her, crossing her legs with elegant composure. Margaret, you made the classic error of the greedy and foolish. You assumed that age equals weakness and that loneliness means vulnerability. But you forgot that I built and ran an empire for decades alongside Robert. You forgot that I survived hostile takeover attempts, ruthless competition, and corrupt politicians who made you look like an amateur. The paramedics, realizing there would be no psychiatric hospitalization, began packing their equipment with visible relief. And Margaret, Victoria added, her voice now soft but utterly relentless, the supreme irony is this. If you had simply visited me regularly with genuine affection, if you had shown authentic care, if you had welcomed Carmen and Kevin as part of our extended family, you would have remained the primary beneficiary in my will. Your own consuming greed and vicious prejudice destroyed the inheritance you so desperately coveted. When the police officers entered the mansion, they encountered a surreal scene. An elegant elderly woman calmly serving juice to a young boy while methodically explaining how she had dismantled a criminal conspiracy to steal her fortune and autonomy. Meanwhile, 3 devastated adults waited to be arrested for attempted fraud, extortion, and illegal practice of medicine. Watching Margaret being handcuffed while still attempting to sputter about family traditions and social propriety, Victoria experienced a profound realization. True justice wasn't found in her sister-in-law's imprisonment. It was in the discovery that genuine family transcends race, social class, and surname. It requires only love, loyalty, and mutual respect. 2 years later, the Whitmore mansion had been completely transformed. What had once been a silent mausoleum now resonated with laughter during Sunday dinners, where 10-year-old Kevin enthusiastically recounted his school adventures to Victoria, who listened with the rapt attention of a devoted grandmother. Carmen had officially become the estate manager, with a salary commensurate with her exceptional dedication and expanded responsibilities. Kevin attended one of the city's finest private schools, his remarkable mathematical talents flourishing under Victoria's constant encouragement and support. Margaret Pierce was serving a 3-year sentence for attempted fraud, conspiracy, and elder exploitation. Her house had been sold at auction to pay court-ordered fines. Her former elite social circles now shunned her like a pariah, and her name had become synonymous with greed and betrayal. Dr. Mitchell had permanently lost his medical license and faced additional criminal charges in 2 other states where his previous misconduct had been uncovered. David Wellington had been disbarred following disciplinary proceedings that ended his legal career in disgrace. Aunt Victoria, Kevin said during dinner one evening, his eyes bright with excitement. "My teacher wants to meet you." She said she's never encountered a student so confident during class presentations. Victoria smiled warmly, remembering the shy boy who had timidly sat at her table 2 years ago. "Of course, sweetheart. It would be my honor." Carmen observed the scene from the kitchen doorway, still sometimes amazed at how dramatically their lives had transformed. It wasn't merely the financial security, though that was certainly wonderful. It was a profound sense of belonging she had never imagined possible, the feeling of being genuinely valued and loved. Jonathan Myers had become a regular visitor to the mansion, bringing quarterly reports about the growing educational foundation Victoria had established for underprivileged children. "Over 100 scholarships approved this year," he announced during his latest visit, spreading documents across the dining table. "Your legacy extends far beyond these walls, Victoria." Victoria looked around the table at her chosen family. Kevin working diligently on his homework, occasionally asking her for help with a particularly challenging math problem. Carmen organizing foundation paperwork with meticulous care. Jonathan discussing new social initiatives and expansion opportunities. This was exactly the family she had always yearned for but never knew how to find. The lesson had crystallized with perfect clarity. Margaret had forfeited a fortune because she couldn't see beyond the color of a child's skin. Her consuming greed and toxic prejudice had blinded her to what truly mattered: character, loyalty, and authentic love. Victoria had learned that genuine family isn't defined by bloodlines or surnames, but by those who choose to stand beside you during difficult times. Kevin and Carmen hadn't merely filled the emptiness in her life. They had transformed her into a better, more generous, and infinitely happier person. When Margaret attempted to destroy this family out of pure racial prejudice and financial greed, she failed to understand she was attacking the only thing Victoria truly valued, and that miscalculation had sealed her own fate. True wealth, Victoria had discovered, isn't measured by what we accumulate in bank accounts or real estate holdings. It's measured by who we choose to love and who chooses to love us in return. As she watched Kevin laugh at something Carmen said, and as she felt the warmth of belonging that had been absent from this house for so many years, Victoria knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice that evening when a shy boy had sat down beside her. Sometimes the greatest inheritance we can leave isn't money or property. It's the example of choosing love over prejudice, connection over isolation, and humanity over hatred. The Whitmore Mansion, once an echoing monument to loneliness, had finally become what was always meant to be: a home filled with laughter, love, and the irreplaceable bonds of chosen family.